Hi everyone. So this is the app that I decided to compose for the Fermi Project. Now, before I go deeper into the Fermi Project as well as the analysis and investigations, let me just show you around the app interface a little bit. So down here we have the required categories for the Fermi Project. So we have the question, the wild guess, the educated guess, the actual results, conclusions, the sources of error, the interesting facts, as well as the future investigations. And obviously the purpose of this app is to present to you the Fermi question that I had chosen. I decided to incorporate some apps development pictures or images here, give us a feel of what we're going to be experiencing in the next 5 to 7 minutes or so. So let's go ahead and get to the question. Wait for this to load. The question that I decided to research consisted of how many lines of code would it take to program the world's apps? And here I decided to incorporate some more images that deal with the computer science themes, so software engineers, lines of code, as well as just programming on MacBooks, because who doesn't like that? So let's go ahead and get to my wild guess. So for my wild guess, I would have to go with 10 to the power of 9, which is equal to about 1 billion lines of code. And yeah, it's a wild guess, so no logic whatsoever required. Now let's go ahead and dive into my educated guess. So, based off of the various categories within the Google Play Store as well as the App Store, I would infer that there are about 10 million apps in the world's app market. Obviously integrated some scientific notation here. So in addition to that, based off of the wide array of functions that each app within the App Store serves, so whether it be for social media purposes or for gaming and leisure purposes, a decently functioning app would have 5,000 lines of code. And that's because it accounts for conditional statements, arrays of code, as well as a multitude of classes and functions within the app that have to be programmed and coordinated. So now, in order to determine the number of lines of code it would take to program the world's apps, I would have to know N, which is the number of apps in the world, which I assumed was 10 million. And A, which is the average lines of code it would take to program the app, which I also assumed was around 5,000 lines. That would yield my equation to be N times A to equal T, my total. So here's some of the work that I did for this equation. So the dimensional analysis here is that there are 5,000 lines of code per one app. And now we have to multiply that by the 10 million apps there are globally. That would yield 50 billion lines of code to program the world's apps. Let's go ahead and see what the actual and verified answer is. Alright, here's our actual result. Alright, so for our verified data, so according to the tech media outlet Fast Code Design, there are about 10,000 lines of code on average that go into a versatile app, which is about 5,000 off from my estimate of 5,000. So when it comes to the number of apps there are on the Google Play Store, as well as the general App Store, the total comes out to be 5 million apps, according to Statista. So knowing this, we can finally go back to my original equation and plug in those values. So for A, our average lines of code it would take to program one app, that's about 10,000, times N, which is the 5 million apps there are globally, which would finally yield 50 billion lines of code to program the world's apps. Alright. So what conclusions or implications does that have for us? So first of all, I'd like to discuss the process that I utilized to get my educated guess. So the process that I had utilized to get my educated guess consisted of prior knowledge that I had in regards to apps development. So because of the many components of apps that go together in order for the app to work as a whole, I estimated that each app would have 5,000 lines of code and then applied it to the estimate of the 10 million apps there are in the app stores. Now with those two assumptions, that's how I generated the equation N times A, which equals T, where that would grant me my end result, which is the total lines of code it would take to program the world's apps. I used the same exact process to get my final answer, except I conducted research on that portion or on both of those assumptions and acquire the actual numbers and then plug them into my equation. So what are some of the possible sources of error that I could have had in my equation or within my process in general? So first off, my calculation could gradually become irrelevant and extremely flawed due to a variety of factors actually. So for instance, the lines of code it takes to program an app varies for every single app. And so while the average is 10,000 lines, other apps may have well above that number or well below that number, rendering my calculation as inaccurate. Finally, mobile software engineers are publishing apps on a daily basis. And so my end result could be lower than the actual number of lines of code it takes to program the newest apps, which are far more complex, of course. So what are some interesting facts that I learned while researching through this entire process? So some of the most popular iPhone or Android apps are downloaded more than 1 billion times. Yes, you heard that correctly. Smartphone users actually spent the most time on gaming apps and the least time on lifestyle and fitness apps. Not really a surprise. And so what does this hold for the future? Or if we were supposed to investigate this further into our futures? So as the solutions to programming become more elegant day by day, meaning software engineers are coming up with shorter and more substantive solutions, they're going to find ways to write the same apps with less lines of code. And so my result, the 50 billion lines of code, can be compared to their new results to denote the difference in the average lines of code it takes to program the world's apps. That's it. I hope you enjoyed this app. Thank you so much for listening.